Welcome back, everyone. This is our House Calls series, From Confusion to Clarity. Today we're talking about ethics. So, Barry, ethics is up your alley, so to speak, because of your degree in bioethics. This should be an interesting conversation for the two of us.
Yeah, I think so. I've been a bit surprised during the pandemic how little discussion there's been about ethics, because I think it can add a lot to the decision making that has been done and can be done in terms of dealing with the pandemic.
Now, do you think that ethics can help us reach beyond how we've been responding in fear, how we can respond to one another differently?
I think it can. There are a lot of moral principles that I think we can all understand, and I think we can apply them to get better results perhaps than we have.
Okay.
One of the ways we can do it is that ethics can be helpful is in the understanding of values. So values are things that we hold near and dear, that we cherish, upon which we often build our lives. And there are a lot of different ways of looking at values. One way we can discuss different values is that some values tend to be aesthetic in nature, others tend to be ethical. So aesthetic values relate to things that we like, we enjoy, we want more of, we're willing to spend our hard-earned money for because they give us pleasure. So for example, we might value art. But the thing is, the art that I value may not be the same art that you value. The music I like may not be the same music you like. The fashion I like may be different from your fashion. In other words, beauty is often in the eye of the beholder. In addition, sometimes our aesthetic values change over time. The fashions that we wore in the 70s may not appeal to us so much in the 1990s. Now, ethical values are different. They're not about what we get. They're more about how do we treat other people.
Exactly.
And what's different between ethical and aesthetic values is really twofold. One is that we have a sense that they should be universal. In other words, if I have an ethical value that says that human life should be held as sacred, then I will develop moral principles to protect that sacredness. So, for example, I'll dictate that we should not murder people. But my hope, of course, is that everybody out there shares the same moral principle of the sacredness of human life, and therefore agrees completely as well that murder is something that we ought not do. The other thing that's important that makes a difference between aesthetic and ethical values is that there's a certain timelessness to them for the most part. If we believe that human life is sacred in 2021 and murdering is morally wrong in 2021, we'd like to believe that the same will be true in 2031, 2041, etc.
You know, I like that you said the sacredness of life, because it reminds me of the fact that most spiritual belief systems have already been formed with that in mind. I mean, they have a system of how we teach one another, how we behave with one another. And it is, it's a testament, it's a universal respect for the sacredness of each individual life.
Yeah, there have been so many different codes that have been developed over the years that essentially say the same thing, the golden rule, treat others the way you would like to be treated. So the Hammurabi Code of Babylon, the Hebrew 10 Commandments, the Roman and Greek laws that form an awful lot of our present legal system, the Magna Carta, the American Constitution, the Nuremberg Code, even our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, all basically deal with how should we treat each other, what are the boundaries of how we behave in a civil society. They're really ethical in nature.
You know, I liked, you kind of almost described them in terms of history of how human rights laws are formed. And you said the words, it's a code, it's a declaration, it's a commandment, like the 10 Commandments, and then it becomes another law. And so the human rights really do form from our history. You know, something has happened awful to one individual, and so they said never again, you know, in particular with the Nuremberg trial, or Nuremberg Code actually. But I think it's important for people to realize that our history, or our human rights history, has been formed on our past, actually.
And, a lot of that past obviously has not been pretty, which is why we've had to develop these codes.
Yeah.
I mean, I say to people, imagine, for example, Paula, if you were on a desert island alone and I was on a desert island alone. Well, obviously, both of us have complete freedom to do as we wish. We have no limits on what we can do. But as soon as the two of us end up on the same desert island together, everything changes. Now, all of a sudden, I have rights to my shelter, which means you have an obligation not to tear down my shelter. You have rights to the food you've gathered. I have an obligation not to steal your food. So there has to be a certain sense of reciprocity when we're living in community, where our rights and obligations have to be reciprocal in nature. And, by and large, most of us like the idea of rights, because rights are about what we get. But obligations is about what we owe to other people. And obligations just intrinsically will put limits on our freedom because of the reciprocal nature of rights and obligations. So the struggle in a civil society is, how do we balance the rights and obligations of the individual, for example, with the rights and obligations of society in such a way that neither one has all the rights or the other one has all the obligations, for example. That balance can be very difficult to find.
Exactly. Because, when the pandemic hit, it seemed that society's rights, like the rights of the collective, trumped or completely outweighed the rights of any individual.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to apply ethics to the pandemic, for example, you have to have a fearless and a clear sense of how to balance the rights and obligations of society with that of the individual. And you do that with dialogue, not debate. You do that with compassion, with creativity, with open-mindedness to avoid what we called before the killing certainties. And the answers are seldom going to be simple. They're seldom going to be binary, because we live in a complex world with 7 billion unique individuals. So for example, although it certainly would make sense to limit the number of visitors to a nursing home to reduce the impact of COVID being brought into the nursing home, on the other hand, we have to perhaps balance that with the fact that if someone is dying in a nursing home, perhaps we have to make exceptions to the no visitor rules. In other words, context has to matter to some point. Otherwise, it's too easy to follow, as you said, into the horrors that we've experienced, for example, in World War II, in which individual rights were completely ignored, and that's why the Nuremberg Code was developed.
I like that you gave the example of like a long-term care or a nursing home where a resident there is dying. The measures that have been written have been done to actually protect the collective, but at the same time, while doing that, they've restricted the rights and freedom of the individual. Like the person, like if I was in a long-term care home or if I was in a hospital dying, we've heard plenty of stories where loved ones are not allowed at their loved one's place of death because of these protocols. And so that's actually awful that that's happening.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that although health is a very important value for all of us, it's not the only value we have, and it isn't necessarily always the most important value either. I mean, we value our work, we value our leisure, we value education, we value freedom, we value our spiritual traditions, for example, and we need to be able to balance all of those different values with health. Health cannot trump every other value all the time. It has to be a creative and compassionate balancing of all of them.
But can ethics help with balancing the rights and obligations of society with the rights and obligations of an individual? Can ethics help?
Well, I think that there's a number of principles, some of which we've already referred to in previous videos. First one I would say is avoiding, binary reacting. I wouldn't say binary thinking anymore, I'd say binary reacting. For example, if you want to wear a mask outdoors, I don't have a problem with it, but perhaps you got to think along the spectrum. Your risk of getting COVID when you're outdoors anyway is fairly low. Perhaps you can reduce that from 1 in 20,000 without a mask to 1 in 10,000 with a mask, but it's not a black or white issue, it's a spectrum issue.
Oh, sorry.
And so it really comes down to, again, another principle we talked about earlier, was the difference between dialogue and debate. Dialogue is not a zero-sum game the way debate is. It's much more creative, and it's much more an evolving process than kind of a dead-end process.
I'm going to just interject and say that we're bringing up the word binary thinking again, or binary reactioning, and because it's very important to understand, like when we're talking about ethics now, we have reacted from a place of binary thinking. And so when I ask, can ethics help? Yes, we have to move beyond that into those spectrums of possibilities, ethical possibilities of how to treat one another.
Yeah, and so much about ethics is about being creative and being open-minded and being open to other perspectives. There's a couple of great expressions. One is, none of us is smarter than all of us put together. Harry S. Truman once said, you can accomplish anything provided it doesn't matter who gets the credit. And, I look at the pandemic and how it's rolled out. How much interest have the experts and the authorities had in public input? I mean, we just had a federal election. How much interest was there from the authorities in terms of what the public thought about how the pandemic was being measured or being handled? I'm not sure there was much. So there's a sense that somehow the average Canadian doesn't have an opinion, shouldn't have an opinion, has nothing to offer. I don't think that's true at all. I think Canadians are educated and wise, and I think they deserve to have more input into how the pandemic is being rolled out.
I couldn't agree with you more. How about we wrap this up for now? Ethics is going to be a long conversation for us. Or unless you want to add something?
Well, I was just going to add one little thing, Paula, and that was that we have to realize that one of the things ethics can teach us, and it has to relate to open-mindedness, is that each of us is unique, and therefore each of us has our own unique biases. Every authority, every expert, every politician has their own unique bias. You can't avoid that. And, at the end of the day, we have to accept that reality because there's no getting around it. As we say in ethics, there is no view from nowhere, which means we have to have a tremendous humility when we do ethics. We have to be open-minded and humble because we have to have the ability to admit when we're wrong. We have to have the ability to ask questions, even if that's embarrassing to do so. We have to be open to other people's perspectives because that helps to balance off our own intrinsic biases that we can't get away from. Otherwise, if we don't do that, if we're not open to other perspectives, then, well, quite frankly, we're no longer doing science and we're no longer doing democracy either. Another extremely important principle is that of transparency. It's critical. And, if we're going to, for example, accept that our freedoms are going to be limited by the authorities, then I think they need to at least be respectful enough of us that they explain to us in a transparent fashion why they're doing so. Whenever there isn't transparency, we tend to get worried. What are they not telling us and why are they not telling us? And frankly, lack of transparency is a sign of really of disrespect, that we don't deserve or we can't know the full truth because we're not capable or we're not deserving of it. It's disrespectful not to be transparent. And so a good example would be that during the lockdowns, a lot of the justification for what they were doing with the lockdowns was to spare the healthcare system, which is a laudable goal. But I never really got an update about exactly how overwhelmed the system was. Because the truth is, the healthcare system, at least in my almost 40 years of working in it, is often overwhelmed on a regular basis. And although it's laudable for us to not want to overwhelm the system, we were never really given that many updates about exactly how busy the hospitals were. And I get a sense sometimes they weren't nearly as busy as was purported to be.
Many people have actually, in that lack of transparency, many people have sought to find out exactly that about the hospital capacities, and it turns out that they weren't as busy as what we've been led to believe. And so thank goodness many people are bringing truth to light out there right now. So
that's great, Paul. So I think there's a few other ethical principles we can discuss perhaps in the next couple of videos.
Yeah, because this is it's a large topic, and we'll break it down into chunks for ourselves and for others. So.
Great.
Okay. Thanks so much, Barry.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.